Graeme Maxton is author and former Secretary General of the Club of Rome, and he's joining us from Taiwan today. He's an internationally renewed climate change economist, best-selling author and speaker on the challenges facing humanity, climate change, poverty, unemployment, and inequality. His areas of expertise include international economic development, as well as geopolitics, climate change, sustainable business, energy, the automotive industry, the impact of aging on growth, and the factors that inspire positive long-term human development. Mr. Maxton, you say we need a radical change to avoid a catastrophe, and for that to happen, we need a different mindset, not new technology. The title of your presentation is Energy, Climate Change, and the Endless Push for Economic Growth. Why we need a different mindset, not new technology. We look forward to your presentation. Welcome.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Good morning, good Scott. I'm delighted to be able to join you today. I'm going to talk to you about climate change. I'm going to talk to you about energy, and I'm going to talk to you about why the solution to these very substantial ecological problems comes in changing the way we think. We don't have to invent anything. We just have to change the way we view the world and change the balance between humanity and nature. And that's why I'm particularly keen to speak to you today, because I know that the conference you've had here has been about a spiritual rebirth, about changing the way we approach the world. And that's exactly the way we can fix a problem as big as climate change. I'm going to talk, first of all, about what's happening. I think everybody has a pretty good idea about what's happening with climate change, but I want to talk about what's been happening recently, and then about some of the longer-term effects of climate change, which are perhaps easier to forget because they don't make the news every day. Then I want to talk about why societies are not responding as they should. We think that because we're buying electric cars or we're building solar panels or wind farms, that we're responding to the climate crisis. We think that because we have something like the Paris Climate Agreement in 2014, that we're doing something to fix it. But actually, the situation is getting worse and is worse today than it's ever been. And we're not doing anything to fix it. So I want to just explain a little bit about why. Then I'll talk about what's needed, which is remarkably simple. Then how we can make it happen. And then talking about changing the way we think and about what you can do as an individual to try and improve the situation. If I was to characterize the situation, I would put it as a conversation like this. On the left, we have a man saying, we have to choose between the current economic system and the future of life on Earth. And the woman saying, what? Well, it's quite obvious then, isn't it? We have to save the economy. It's a bit like the response that we've had to COVID-19, where we've had a constant battle between the economic system on one side and the health of people on the other. And in many countries, that battle has become particularly intense, that the economy has often been put before the well-being of people. And we're doing something similar with climate change. We're thinking too much about the economic system as it exists today, about how to maintain the rates of growth, when in fact, to fix climate change, we have to dismantle much of the economic system. So we're thinking about the economy and not the long-term well-being of humanity. Just this summer, we've seen unprecedented floods in Europe. We've seen floods in Germany, and Belgium, and Austria, and Romania, and Italy. Particularly badly affected in Germany and Belgium, with more than 200 people dead. We've seen fires in Europe, in Greece, in Turkey, in Spain, and in Siberia, unprecedented fires in Siberia. We've seen floods in Japan. You can see from this picture on the right, in 3 days, one part of southern Japan had more than 1,000 millimeters of rain. So more than a meter of rain in 3 days. Now, my wife and I frequently watch the Japanese news in the evening. And almost every week, somebody is saying that they've had more rain in a day than normally they have in a month. We've seen floods in China, pictures a few months ago of people being trapped in trains underground as the floodwaters rose. We've seen fires in North America, particularly in California. I'll talk more about that in a minute. We've seen droughts in North America. It's actually even questionable now whether in the long term it'll be possible for people to continue living in the west coast of America, because the drought is becoming so severe and the water shortages will continue. Droughts in South America, notably in Argentina, droughts in Africa and in Central Asia. I want to just talk about what's happening more long-term there, because that's the picture that we see this year. That's what's happened when we've read the newspapers this year. And we've kind of got used to this news. It's going to get worse. These floods and fires and droughts will get worse, no matter what we now do. But we can do something about it in the long term. In the long term, this is a picture from Germany. This is the forests in Germany. And they're suffering because of drought, because of too much rain at times, because of increasing insect infestations. And across Germany, a lot of the forests are dying. Instead of absorbing CO2 and helping us solve the problem, they're now decaying and releasing CO2 and making the problem worse. And this is happening in other parts of the world as well. A couple of years ago, because of droughts in southern Germany, the River Rhine began to dry up, and it made it impossible for ships, for cargo ships to travel up and down the river. At the time, my wife and I were living in Switzerland, and the price of diesel and petrol went up because the ships were unable to travel down the river, and they had to use road transport to bring the fuel to Switzerland, and that meant prices went up. So there's a direct economic consequence because of climate change on businesses. This is a picture of the Rhone Glacier a couple of years ago, where they were beginning to cover the glacier with tarpaulins to try and stop the rate of melt. The mountains are being affected in lots of different ways, and perhaps in the conversation afterwards, Michaela Agata can talk about this as well. But a lot of the climbing paths in the mountains, not just in the Alps, but in America and also in the Himalayas in India and Pakistan, the mountains are beginning to crumble because the ice which sits at the top of the mountains and the glaciers is melting. And as the ice melts, the rocks begin to fall apart and the mountains begin to crumble. And so a lot of the hiking routes in these mountains have become much more dangerous, and some of them have even disappeared in the last few years. This is a picture from Mozambique in 2019, where two cyclones hit the area within a few weeks of each other, causing absolute devastation, as you can see. Cyclones don't normally hit this part of Africa. This is a picture from 2019 from Chennai in India, where 11 million people faced the prospect of no water a few years ago because of drought. India faces particularly severe water problems and will face more severe problems in the next 10 years, which the prospect of many of the main cities running out of groundwater because of climate change. In Bangladesh, the major issue has been migration. Because of sea level rises, Bangladesh is very low lying and will become one of the first affected by rising sea levels. And so what's happening is that India has built a security fence around Bangladesh to keep people in. Migration is going to be one of the big topics of concern when it comes to climate change in the coming decades, because a lot of areas of the world will become too hot and too dry to live in some cases too wet. And already we've seen migration from Syria and North Africa into Europe because of climate change, and that trend will accelerate. And so there will become something of a political issue around climate change in the coming decade as well. This is a picture from Bekasi in Western Java in Indonesia. Here, sea levels have risen to such an extent that in the local graveyard, they can only bury the dead when the tide is out. In the local school, they can now only have classes when the tide is out as well. When the tide comes in, both the graveyard and the school get flooded. This is a picture from Hong Kong a couple of years ago with the damage caused by a typhoon. This is a modern glass and steel building, and what you see is not a building which has been damaged by fire, it's been damaged by wind. And this is the kind of power that we can expect from nature in the coming years, unless we change what we're doing. This is a picture from the wildfires in California. This is in 2018. It's a chart I used to use when I was with the Club of Rome. In 2018, there were 8,300 fires, affecting 800,000 hectares, and it included the largest fire in California's history. But if I have an update for 2021, that fire in 2018 is now the third largest fire. There was a bigger fire in 2020, and there's a bigger fire this year as well. And this has direct economic consequences. The cost of fighting these fires in America is going up steadily. If you go back to 1985, the firefighting costs in the US were about $240 million a year. Today, they're 10 times as much, $2.4 billion a year. In response to these rising temperatures, one of the things that's happening in California is that they're beginning to paint the roads. They're beginning to paint the roads white to increase the level of reflectivity and so reduce the average temperature in the towns. In New York, they're painting a lot of the rooftops white for exactly the same reason. There is some question as to exactly how effective this is, but it's a way to try and reduce the temperature in cities. And finally, in this collection of pictures of what's happening around the world, a picture from the Yamal Peninsula in Siberia. The permafrost in Siberia and in Canada is melting because of rising temperatures. And trapped beneath the permafrost are large pockets of both methane and carbon dioxide. And as the permafrost melts, this gas is coming to the surface, and in some cases it explodes, leaving these craters, as you can see on the right. This is also adding to the problem of climate change because it's releasing CO2 and methane, both of which are warming gases, which are accelerating the pace of climate change. And so this melting of the permafrost in Siberia is a problem which we really need to do something about very quickly. We know that the average temperature is rising, and you can see here from 1850 through to 2020 that the temperature has risen by about 1.2 degrees from its average in the 19th century. We can also see, if you look at the dotted line on the right, that the pace is accelerating. I'll explain a little bit about why that's happening, but it makes the task more urgent. Now, 1.2 degrees might not seem very much. The temperature, I'm sure, in Südtirol today is not much more than 1 or 2 degrees different from what it was yesterday, and it doesn't seem like it's very important at all. But we need to think about the temperature of the Earth in the same way that we think about the temperature of our own bodies. Our bodies function at 37 degrees, and if they go up by 1 degree, then that's medically classified as a fever. If they go up by 2 degrees, then our lives are in danger. And it's very similar with the planet. A 1 degree increase in average temperatures is actually a very large change, and a 2 degree increase actually takes us to a very dangerous situation. Let me show you something about the long-term picture. This is a chart which looks very complicated, but I'll try and make it relatively simple. This shows the average temperature on the planet for the last 65 million years. You can see at the left, 65 million years ago to 40 million years ago, the temperature was much higher. It was 8, 9, 12 degrees higher than the average. And then on the far right-hand side, you can see the temperature for the last 500,000 years. Let me just zoom in on that a little bit. You can see there the last 500,000 years, the temperature rising and falling. If I use my mouse, I hope you can see that at the bottom right-hand corner there, the last ice age, which was just over 11,000 years ago. And you can see where we are here. This is the last few thousand years, actually, in the Earth's temperature. And the average, this 0, is the average for the last 500,000 years. So where we are today is where we were in 1850, is this green arrow here. it was about 2 degrees above the average for the last 500,000 years. It was a relatively warm period in the Earth's temperature. Now, what's happened is that with this 1 degree rise, we've gone up to this orange line, so that we're now above the average temperature for the last 500,000 years. Now, if we let the temperature continue to rise, and we talk about a 2 degree increase in average temperatures, by which they mean this red line here, then I'll show you what the effect of that would be in a minute. But if we let it go to 4 degrees, which is where we're currently heading without change, then that would take us to this purple line. A 2 degree increase, this line here, this red line, takes the planet back 3 million years in terms of its average temperature. If you think about the planet 10 million years ago, 10 million years ago, it looked completely different from the way it is today. And yet that's when we talk about a 2 degree increase in average temperatures, that's what we mean, that we'll take the planet back 10 million years. If we carry on without changing, as we're doing today, we'll take the planet back 4 degrees, which will take it back 40 million years, to a time where the only sorts of life forms on the planet were fish, lizards, and insects. It would be very difficult for us to survive a temperature change as great as 4 degrees. Now, that's what we're currently heading towards by the end of this century without change. That's not to say that we'll have 4 degrees by the end of the century. It's that it'll be unstoppable at that time. There are very long lags in the climate system, which make it much more difficult to control. But we're dealing with a system, a very delicate system, which we've upset the balance of. And it's a very large and complicated system. Why have we got into this situation? Well, the simple reason is because we're burning fossil fuels. There's a very direct correlation between the level of emissions of fossil fuels and the temperature of the planet. This time is a chart which shows the last 800,000 years. And you can see 800,000 years ago on the bottom left, and you can see the temperature, the red line along the bottom, and you can see the emissions of CO2, or the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere over that 800,000 years, and you can see that there's a very close correlation. If I put this chart up for methane or nitrous oxide, the two other main greenhouse gases, you would see exactly the same picture, a very close correlation between these gas emissions and the temperature. And what we've done in the last 150 years is vastly increase the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels. So since 1820, the CO2 concentration has risen to the highest level in more than 800,000 years. Again, you can see the level of CO2 at the bottom there over the last 800,000 years. Before the Industrial Revolution began in the early 19th century, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere was about 280 parts per million. And since then, it has risen steadily, so that this year, in 2021, it's 420 parts per million. So it's risen by 50% and is now higher than it's been in 800,000 years. Same is true for methane and nitrous oxide. They haven't risen as much, but they have also increased dramatically. And that's in many ways worse because both those gases have a much greater warming effect on the planet. I hope you begin to understand by what I'm saying how large this problem is, how colossal the scale of the problem is, and how complicated it is, and also how urgent it is. When we talk about buying electric cars or building solar power panels or setting up wind power farms, it really has a tiny impact on what is a very large and complicated problem, as I'll now explain with this chart. Oh, sorry, before I go on to that, we're not planning any change at this point. There are no serious plans for change in terms of the fossil emissions that we're going to create in the next 20 years. This is a chart from BP Energy in 2018. If you go to the other major oil companies, they have forecasts which are similar. And each of these three graphs basically says the same thing. On the left, you can see the oil, gas, and coal share of total energy will still be above 70% in 2040. If you look at the chart on the right, you can see the amount of energy being generated by coal has fallen steadily since 1900. Oil has increased and is now going down, and gas has increased, but the combined effect of those three fossil fuels is still that they will be accounting for 70% of the total energy produced in 2040. There are no serious plans to change the amount of energy that comes from fossil fuels at this point to reduce it to anything like the level that's required to cut the rate of global warming. We have about a decade to make some very strange, big changes, and that's not long. This chart goes back to 2005. If I look at this green line here, you can see on the left, this is the volume of carbon dioxide that's being emitted and the trend line. And you can see that blue dotted line on the left. That's what's happening if we don't do anything. That's what happens if we don't make any radical changes, which is the way we're heading today. And that will take us to an increase in average temperatures of between 4 and 5 degrees centigrade. It'll kick off a chain reaction which will be almost impossible to stop. The yellow line is what has been committed in Paris, in the Paris Agreement in 2014. If every country sticks to what it's committed to, then that will reduce the temperature to around a 3-degree increase, which is still far higher than is safe. And the other lines show what needs to happen to keep us safe. The green line shows that if we had started cutting emissions in 2011, we would have had until well beyond 2050 before we had to phase out fossil fuels entirely. If we'd started in 2015, the blue line, we could have taken until after 2045 before we'd been able to have to phase out all fossil energy. If we'd started in 2020, the pink line, we would have had to have stopped all fossil fuel emissions by 2040. In fact, we haven't done anything radical to stop the level of emissions at all. We're still increasing the volume of emissions that we're putting out. And Paris actually doesn't have any cuts attached to it until after 2030. But we need to be cutting emissions now. This is going to be a very difficult task, and this is what I talked about a few minutes ago, about how people think that there are simple solutions to this problem. It's a very complicated chart, but let me try and make it relatively simple. This orange and yellow part here are the emissions that come from energy. The blue part is from industrial processes, the purple part is from agriculture, the green part is from land use change and deforestation, and the pink part at the bottom is from waste. On the right-hand side, you can see the types of gases that are being released, the greenhouse gases that are being released because of these activities: CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. The others are much smaller. Now, if you just take one area here, if we just take this road transportation here at the top in the yellow, road transport accounts for 11.9% of all emissions today. So 12%, let's say. And it comes from 1.2 billion vehicles which are on the world's roads. Now, there's a great deal of effort being put into building electric vehicles. And today we're selling perhaps a few 100,000 electric vehicles. But if you consider that this 12% of the gases is coming from the 1.2 billion vehicles which are already on the world's roads, and we add a few electric vehicles, a few 100,000 electric vehicles to that total, you can see their effect is going to be very small indeed. Because most of those vehicles will continue to produce all those polluting gases because they will continue to burn fossil fuels. So what we're doing with electric vehicles is making the situation slightly better, but only to a very marginal degree. It's not going to solve the problem in anything like the time frame that's needed. If we take another one, if we go down to the third line there, residential buildings, It's possible now, of course, to make buildings which are very green and sustainable, which produce almost no emissions, which are good for recycling water, which don't need air conditioning, don't need heating. But again, the problem is that there are millions of buildings that exist today. And what we need to do is cut their emissions, that adding a few more buildings which are green don't solve the problem. When people talk about simple solutions and they talk about financing, clever financing, or they talk about investments in green energy, all these things will help, but the scale of the problem is so large and the time that's remaining is so short that they're not going to help to any great degree. If everybody in Europe suddenly became 100% sustainable tomorrow, that would not be enough to stop what's happening. Europe only accounts for about 10% of global emissions. We need to stop everybody burning this fossil energy, and we need to stop them doing it as fast as possible. I'll talk more about that in a second. If we don't, then this is what will happen. This is one snapshot of what will happen in the next 30, 40 years. This is a picture of the world showing the Palmer Drought Severity Index. And you can see the parts of the world that are particularly dry. There in South America, around the Mediterranean. You can see Greece and Turkey there, where the levels of drought are particularly high. You can see areas in China here. In 10 or 20 years from now, this is what it'll look like. That the droughts that affect the area around the Mediterranean and places like northern Spain will become much more severe. They'll also become more severe in South America. And if we carry on without change for another 20 or 30 years until 40 or 50 years from now, this is what it'll look like. Much of the area around the Mediterranean will become progressively uninhabitable. So we need to make some very big changes. So the question now is, why are societies not responding as they should? The problems that I've just spoken about are well known. We know that the climate's getting warmer. We know that this problem will get worse. We know why this is happening. And yet today, the level of emissions is higher than it's ever been before. So what's stopping us changing? And the answer, unfortunately, is that we're choosing not to fix it. We know what we need to do. We know how to solve this problem. It's just that we don't want the pain that's involved with that. We don't want the disruption to our lives. And so we're choosing not to fix the problem. A central part of that is that our economic system is focused on growth. Every year, the newspapers talk about the rate of growth. We have to increase the rate of growth. We have to produce more. Output has to go up. And output is directly tied to energy. To increase the production means we have to increase the amount of energy we use. And because 80% of that energy comes from fossil fuels, we increase emissions, and that causes climate change. So there's a direct link between the push for growth and the accelerating rate of climate change. It's the economic system that's causing the problem. A second reason that we're having difficulty fixing this problem is, and I don't say this happily, is democracy. First, the democratic system has been corrupted by big business and the rich, particularly in the US, but in Brussels too. And that the voice of big business to carry on today, to produce more fossil energy, to increase output has become out of balance with the needs of the people. So if we're to move ahead, we need to reduce the power of big business and big corporates and rich individuals. Democracy is also a problem because to solve this climate change crisis, we need to convince the majority of people that there has to be change. We need to persuade them that we need to live in a different way. We need to cut our consumption. We need to cut the level of energy we use. We need to live in a more sustainable, different way, in different balance with nature. We need something like a spiritual renewal. But that's difficult because most people either don't understand the scale of the problem or are not interested in doing that. which is part of the third problem I'm going to talk about, which is extreme individualism. We've seen in the response to the coronavirus that people are very keen to live their lives as they choose. They don't want to be told what to do. And that's fine normally, but in a situation where we're facing an existential crisis, that doesn't work. It's not possible for everybody to live the way they've been living for the last 20 years if we're to solve this. We need to think about the needs of society and the needs of humanity and the needs of everybody long term. And that needs a change in thinking. What's needed to fix this? How could we stop this problem? Now, it's actually very simple. We need, first of all, change, regardless of the social and economic costs. And that's also the problem we're facing with COVID, that we're not willing to make these social and economic reforms to solve the problem with the virus. But in this case, this is existential. This affects our ability to survive as a species long term. We need to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 8% a year, by 60% by 2030, and 0 by 2040. And that doesn't mean net zero. You see a lot of businesses and governments talking about net zero, about offsetting the emissions by planting trees, for example. That's not going to work because trees take far too long to grow and the number that we'd have to plant is far too large. So net zero is not going to work. We actually mean 0. Now, an 8% cut in greenhouse gas emissions implies today an 8% reduction in economic activity. We actually have to shrink the economy until we can find a more sustainable system to live by. Now, that's a very radical, difficult thing to implement, but it's one of the things that we need to do if we're to stop the pace of climate change continuing to accelerate. The second thing we need to do is reform agriculture, make it much more localized, cut the use of nitrates in the soils, cut the use of animal farming, reduce the level of animal farming in particular. We need to stop all deforestation and plant trees to help with the problem, not to solve it, unfortunately. And we need to build hundreds of carbon capture plants, which are going to have to operate across the world to suck carbon out of the atmosphere and reduce the concentration that's in the atmosphere today to something more like normal so that the atmosphere begins to stabilize. And we're going to have to run those full blast for at least a century. And if we do all that, then we've probably got a 50-50 chance of being able to avoid a chain reaction in the worst. There is no magical technological solution here. There's no Superman that's going to come along. There's no technology specialist in Silicon Valley that's going to invent something that will make this okay. This is a complicated problem and it's going to have a complicated solution, which is going to be messy, unfortunately. But there's no point in waiting for some Hollywood hero or Superman to come and fix the problem, or the banking sector. And there's no market-based solution to this problem. There's very little about what I'm talking about, which is profitable. This has to be a state-led change. That's all very big and very difficult, and I understand that it seems almost impossible. But it's the only way forward that we've currently got. How do we make that easier? Well, we need to provide a basic income for people to make the transition simpler so that the people don't suffer during the transition. Everybody needs to be paid a basic income forever throughout their lifetimes so that the transition becomes possible. How do we finance that? Well, we can print money to pay for it. Money is not real, it's just numbers on computers. And if we can print money to save the banking system, and we can print money to pay people to stay at home during the COVID crisis, then we can print money to save the planet. Even if it causes inflation and economic troubles, those things won't kill us. Printing money is not real and it won't kill us. Climate change will kill us. And then we need to reframe the debate towards an ecological civilization. We need to gradually move towards something which allows humanity to live in balance with nature. How do we make that happen? It's a very difficult task. I understand that, of course. Well, the first thing we need to do is reclaim democracy. There are a lot of people writing about this today, not just me, Noam Chomsky, Naomi Klein. There are books about how we can reclaim democracy. We need to elect politicians who understand the scale of the problem and push them to make the changes that are needed. It may require something like a technocratic government, like we had in Austria last year, which was able to run the country on a technocratic basis and make the changes that are needed before we can go back to something more democratic. That's a difficult area. But once we have been able to force a democratic push for change, the second thing we need to do is simply cut emissions. We need to do everything we can to reduce the level of emissions, and that must be the only objective. Everything else we're doing in terms of reforming society has to be put into second place. The only goal is to cut emissions. How can you play a role in helping that happen? The most important thing you can do is help spread the word and be systematic about it. Dennis Meadows, who was the author, the primary author of the Limits to Growth book, which recognized this problem more than 50 years ago, said that for change to happen, there need to be two conditions. First of all, you need to care. And secondly, you need to understand. And the problem we have today is that most people care. Most people care about the future of their grandchildren and humanity, but they don't understand. And so what you can do is help people understand. There's a fact sheet you can get, I can provide for any of you, which will give you the data and the information you need. But be systematic. Go to your friends, go to your family, go to your colleagues. Help them understand what needs to happen. Spread the word, because that's the way we're going to make the change happen. Secondly, ask questions of your organization, university, company, wherever you work. Ask questions of the organization to get it on board. How is it going to respond to the climate crisis? What is it doing to change? Push for political reform. Get active. When you see groups like Extinction Rebellion or Fridays for Future, or the movements which have been started even by the Catholic Church, you can begin to see the seeds of the change that are needed. We need to have a bottom-up change. Help plant the seeds of new long-term thinking. What we need here is certainly an economic change, certainly a social change, but we need a spiritual change as well. We need to change the way we view each other and nature if we're going to solve this very difficult problem. Most of all, help others. The only way we're going to be able to solve this problem is through a cooperative transition. And I hope that, though I've given you some very difficult information today, that I've also encouraged you to help others, to help people understand, and to be part of that transition, to join me in trying to make that happen. Thank you very much.